This morning, the Bureau of Reclamation reported Lake Mead hovering near 1,042 feet, while the Colorado River system entered another summer under an active shortage condition and historically weak upstream inflow. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. Lake Mead has fallen more than 20 feet since the beginning of the year. The July forecast places unregulated inflow into Lake Powell at only 2% of the 30-year average. Reclamation has reduced the annual release from Lake Powell to Lake Mead by nearly 1.5 million acre-feet to protect the upstream reservoir. And officials warn that the resulting decline at Lake Mead could cut Hoover Dam generating capacity by as much as 40% this fall. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is the elevation. The hidden number is the amount of water that conservation agreements are temporarily preventing users from removing, and the limited time those agreements remain in force. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a system buying time faster than it is buying certainty. So the question is no longer simply how low Lake Mead will fall. The question is, what happens when conserved water, reduced releases, power production, farm income, city demand, and expiring operating rules all reach the same narrow point? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from. Because this lake is not only showing drought, it is showing where the next system test may begin. Before sunrise in the desert, Lake Mead does not look like an emergency. The water is still. The concrete face of Hoover Dam is still standing. Transmission lines still leave the canyon. Pumps still move water towards cities, farms, and treatment plants. But inside the federal operating system, the day begins differently. The first picture is not a photograph. It is a table. The Bureau of Reclamation daily report tracks the elevation of Lake Mead, releases through Hoover Dam, flows below Glen Canyon Dam, deliveries toward major canals, and the accumulation of water moving through the lower Colorado River. Near the middle of July, that table placed Lake Mead close to 1,042 feet above sea level. A day earlier, the number had been slightly higher. A week earlier, higher again. The movement was not dramatic enough to see from the shoreline in a single morning. It was measured in hundredths of a foot, but the system was moving in one direction, and every decimal represented storage, leaving the reservoir during the hottest and most demanding part of the year. At roughly the same time, another federal dashboard was showing a different warning upstream. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center and the Bureau of Reclamation were tracking runoff into Lake Powell, the reservoir that normally sends water through Glen Canyon Dam and eventually toward Lake Mead. The forecast for the critical spring and summer runoff period had collapsed. In June, unregulated inflow into Lake Powell was only a small fraction of the long-term average. For July, the most probable forecast fell to roughly 2% of normal. 2% is not a weak runoff month. It is the near absence of the seasonal pulse the system was built to capture. Snow should have been melting from the high country, entering tributaries, filling the Colorado River, and rebuilding storage before the next dry season. Instead, the expected pulse arrived thin, early, or not at all. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. Lake Mead falls during summer because deliveries and evaporation rise. Lake Powell has poor runoff years because mountain snow varies. Power production changes because reservoirs are operated across seasons. Conservation agreements come and go because water agencies negotiate new terms, but together they describe one larger configuration. The upstream reservoir was approaching a level that threatened its ability to generate hydropower reliably. The downstream reservoir was already deep inside shortage territory. The natural inflow needed to relieve both was exceptionally weak, and the operating rules that divide the river after 2026 were still being negotiated while the physical system continued to move. That is what the control room sees. Not one red light, several amber lights that are beginning to overlap. In April, the Bureau of Reclamation announced emergency actions designed to protect Lake Powell. Under the previous operating schedule, Glen Canyon Dam was expected to release about 7.48 million acre-feet during the water year. The revised plan reduced that volume to about 6 million acre-feet. The purpose was direct: keep more water in Lake Powell and reduce the probability that it would fall below minimum power pool. The elevation near 3,490 feet, where hydropower operations become severely constrained. From the perspective of Lake Powell, that decision created breathing room. From the perspective of Lake Mead, it removed water that would otherwise have arrived downstream. Nearly 1.5 million acre-feet is difficult to visualize. It is enough water to cover 1.5 million acres with 1 foot of water. It is also several times larger than the annual use of some major metropolitan areas. Not every acre-foot would have appeared in Lake Mead at the same moment, and reservoir operations are more complicated than moving a fixed block from one container to another. But the direction of the effect is simple. Protecting Powell meant sending less water toward Mead. The map shows 2 reservoirs. The operating system sees one connected balance sheet. By early summer, another action was already underway. Water was being moved from Flaming Gorge Reservoir into the Green River system to support Lake Powell. That release was intended to protect a critical upstream elevation. It also revealed how little slack remained. Flaming Gorge is not located beside Lake Powell. It sits hundreds of river miles away. Water released there must travel through the Green River before reaching the Colorado and then entering Powell. In other words, managers were reaching farther into the storage network to defend the system's central infrastructure. This was not a routine seasonal adjustment. It was a transfer of risk across geography. Storage was being reduced in one reservoir to reduce the danger at another, while the reservoir downstream waited for less water than previously planned. The day was becoming a chain of decisions. At Hoover Dam, the consequence appeared in another number. Hydropower does not depend only on how much water passes through a turbine. It also depends on the pressure created by the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the machinery below. As Lake Mead falls, that hydraulic head shrinks. Each unit of water produces less energy. The turbines can still operate, but the margin becomes smaller. Reclamation warned that the reduced release from Lake Powell could push Lake Mead lower and reduce Hoover Dam generating capacity by as much as 40% during the fall. That did not mean 40% of the region would lose electricity. It meant a major source of flexible federal hydropower could become less capable. At the same time, the Southwest was managing heat, high electricity demand, and limited water supplies. Hydropower from Hoover Dam is valuable not only because it produces electricity, it can respond quickly. It helps utilities balance changing demand. It supports public power customers across several states. Losing part of that flexibility does not automatically cause a blackout, but it removes room from a system that depends on room. At the same time, the water delivery network was continuing to operate. The Southern Nevada Water Authority was drawing from deep intake structures built to function at lower elevations. The Central Arizona Project was moving Colorado River water uphill through a long system of canals and pumping stations. Metropolitan Water District facilities were directing water towards Southern California. Irrigation districts were scheduling deliveries to fields where planting decisions had been made months earlier. Every part of that network could still function. That was precisely why the danger was easy to misunderstand. System stress often arrives before visible failure. A pump does not have to stop for operating costs to rise. A turbine does not have to shut down for energy value to decline. A farmer does not have to lose every delivery for uncertainty to alter a planting decision. A city does not have to run out of water for conservation rules, infrastructure spending, and rate structures to change. The event is visible outside. The load begins inside the operating margin. Then there were the conservation agreements. According to the Department of the Interior, 18 short-term agreements in Arizona and California were designed to conserve about 321,000 acre-feet through the end of 2026. Officials estimated that this volume could keep nearly 5 additional feet of elevation in Lake Mead, compared with a scenario in which the water was consumed. That water did not arrive as a new storm. It did not come from an unexpected snowpack. It appeared because someone agreed not to divert it, not to pump it, or not to use it in the way previously planned. Some agreements paid agricultural users to reduce consumption. Others supported efficiency, system conservation, or temporary changes in water use. On the dashboard, the result was water remaining in storage. On the ground, the result could be a fallowed field, a modified irrigation schedule, a changed crop, or a delayed withdrawal. This is where the day becomes difficult to read. Lake Mead, near 1,042 feet, is not the elevation the reservoir would have reached without conservation. The visible lake already contains the effect of emergency action. The number is low after water users have reduced demand, after federal funding has paid for temporary savings, after states have accepted shortage reductions, and after cities have invested in recycling and efficiency. The lake is not showing an untouched natural decline. It is showing a decline that has already been slowed. That means the water level alone cannot reveal how much pressure is being applied behind the scenes. Imagine a patient whose vital signs remain stable only because several medications are working at once. The monitor may show a number within a survivable range, but the number does not tell you what happens when one medication is removed. Lake Mead is not a patient, and reservoir management is not medicine, yet the operational principle is similar. A stable reading can hide the amount of intervention required to produce it. The conservation deals were buying time. The reduced deliveries were buying time. The emergency releases from upstream storage were buying time. The shortage rules were buying time. But each measure came with a limit. Funding expires. Agreements end. Stored water is finite. Political tolerance changes. Agricultural communities absorb costs. Cities eventually face harder reductions, and the river does not respond to negotiation schedules. By midday, none of these systems had failed. Hoover Dam was generating electricity. Water was moving toward Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and farms across the lower basin. The reservoir remained hundreds of feet above the lowest outlet structures. Emergency planners were not ordering evacuations. There was no single siren. But that is what makes an operational warning different from a disaster headline. The warning appears while the system is still working. It appears in the shrinking distance between the current elevation and the next threshold. It appears in a release reduced upstream, a turbine producing less power, a contract paying for less water use, and a forecast showing almost no runoff arriving to replace what is leaving. If each signal is viewed alone, the day can look manageable. Together, they describe a system-preserving function by spending its remaining flexibility. And the strangest detail is that the headline number still does not show the full cost. To understand what 1,042 feet actually means, the next step is to translate elevation into pressure, storage, power, and lost room for error. The number 1,042 sounds precise, but precision can create the wrong picture. It can make Lake Mead seem like a measuring stick standing in water, with one simple line moving downward. That is not what the Bureau of Reclamation is measuring. The elevation is the height of the reservoir surface above mean sea level. It is not the depth of the lake. It does not mean there are 1,042 feet of water beneath every boat, every intake, or every section of shoreline. The bottom rises and falls through submerged canyons, old river channels, shelves, and steep walls. Near Hoover Dam, the water column is far deeper than it is across broad exposed bays. So the headline number is not a direct measurement from the surface to the bottom. It is the vertical position of the entire reservoir within the landscape and within the machinery built around it. 1,042 feet is roughly 318 meters above sea level. That conversion may make the number easier to compare internationally, but it still does not explain the operational meaning. To understand that, the number has to be placed beside other elevations. The Bureau of Reclamation identifies the high water line at Lake Mead near 1,229 feet. At 1,042 feet, the reservoir surface is therefore almost 187 feet below that line. Picture a building nearly 18 stories tall. Now imagine the water surface once reaching the roof, and today sitting near the street. That comparison is imperfect because the reservoir does not have vertical walls everywhere, but it captures the scale of the missing elevation. The white mineral band around the canyon records part of that difference. It is not merely a stain. It is a visible boundary between the water level around which much of the modern system was imagined and the lower level at which the system now has to work. But height is only the first translation. The next is storage. A reservoir is not a straight-sided tank. If Lake Mead were shaped like a giant box, every foot of elevation would contain the same volume of water. It does not. The reservoir spreads across narrow canyons, broad basins, sloping shorelines, and complex underwater terrain. At higher elevations, one vertical foot can cover a larger surface area and represent more water than a foot at a lower elevation. As the lake falls, the relationship between elevation and volume changes. This is why 5 feet of conserved elevation cannot be converted using one permanent formula that works everywhere on the reservoir. Reclamation uses elevation capacity tables developed from surveys and updated measurements to estimate how much storage corresponds to each level. The visible number is vertical, the hidden geometry is horizontal. At about 1,042 feet, Lake Mead is also below the major shortage threshold of 1,075 feet. That threshold matters because the Colorado River operating rules use projected January elevations to determine reductions and required conservation in the lower basin. Below 1,075 feet, the system does not simply observe drought. It begins assigning consequences. Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico face scheduled reductions under agreements intended to slow the decline and distribute part of the shortage. California is treated differently under the established priority system, although it has also participated in conservation programs and voluntary reductions. The reservoir elevation therefore acts as both a physical measurement and a legal switch. Water touches a line on a federal projection, and months later the effect appears in delivery schedules, irrigation decisions, state planning, and negotiations among agencies. The lake does not understand the threshold. The institutions do. That is one reason a single foot can matter so much near an operating boundary. 1 foot may not look dramatic from a highway overlook, but it can change which shortage tier applies, how much water must be conserved, or how managers prepare for the following year. At 1,042 feet, Lake Mead sits below the 1,050-foot boundary, associated with a deeper shortage level under the current framework. It remains above the 1,025-foot line that marks another more severe band of reductions. These numbers are not predictions of collapse. They are decision points. They were created because waiting for the reservoir to approach physical failure would leave too little time to respond. The thresholds move intervention earlier. But the system has now spent years operating near or below levels that were once discussed mainly as contingency zones. The abnormal pattern is not simply that Lake Mead crossed a line. It is that emergency bans have become part of ordinary annual planning. This is not the reservoir temporarily touching an unusual elevation after one dry season. It is an entire management calendar being reorganized around low storage. The number also reaches Hoover Dam through pressure. Water stored high behind the dam contains gravitational potential energy. When it moves down through large penstocks toward the turbines, the difference in elevation creates hydraulic head. More head generally means more pressure and more energy available from each unit of water. When Lake Mead falls, that vertical difference shrinks. The same volume passing through the power plant can produce less electricity than it would at a higher reservoir level. The dam does not suddenly become useless at 1,042 feet. Its generators continue to operate. Wide-head turbines and other modifications have expanded the range over which power can be produced, and current federal technical documents place the estimated minimum power pool near 950 feet. That is far below the current surface. But distance from minimum power pool is not the only measure that matters. Long before the final operating limit is reached, capacity declines, efficiency changes, maintenance and scheduling become more difficult. The system loses flexibility before it loses function. That distinction is essential. A person can still walk while becoming exhausted. A hospital can still operate while running out of staffed beds. A power plant can still generate while losing part of the margin that makes it valuable during sudden changes in demand. The headline is 1,042 feet. The real story is the narrowing space between operating normally and operating carefully. That narrowing appears beyond the turbines. Lower reservoir levels change marina access, boat ramps, navigation routes, shoreline stability, and recreation infrastructure. Roads, once ending near water, can terminate far above it. Floating facilities must be moved or reconfigured. Exposed sediment can become a dust source under dry and windy conditions. Archaeological sites and objects may emerge from areas once submerged. None of these effects alone defines the crisis, but together they show how an elevation becomes a landscape. The number also affects water delivery, although not every intake is equally vulnerable. Southern Nevada invested in a third deep-water intake and a low lake-level pumping station designed to continue drawing water under elevations much lower than those that disabled older infrastructure. That investment reduced one of the most immediate risks to Las Vegas. It did not make the water supply independent of Lake Mead. It changed the weak point. Instead of the first danger being whether water can physically enter an intake, the questions become how much water is legally available, how much energy pumping requires, how treatment and distribution costs change, and how long the broader river system can support withdrawals. Infrastructure can move a threshold downward. It cannot create new river flow. The same principle applies to Hoover Dam. Engineering can extend operations to lower elevations. It cannot replace the lost hydraulic head. Every adaptation buys operating range, but the reservoir still records the balance between what enters and what leaves. This is why the phrase "percent full" can also mislead. Percent full sounds like a fuel gauge. A car at 1/4 of a tank can still use the remaining fuel in a fairly predictable way. Lake Mead is different. Some storage is below the level where it can be released through normal facilities. Some water must remain to support pressure, water quality, environmental conditions, and physical operations. The shape of the reservoir means the last percentage points do not behave like the first. The legal system also allocates water by rules, contracts, priorities, treaties, and annual operating decisions, rather than by dividing whatever remains equally among every user. A low percentage does not tell one city exactly when its tap will stop. A high-sounding volume does not guarantee that every existing demand can continue. The system depends on location, elevation, timing, infrastructure, and law. The number is not just water. It is water positioned in a machine. And the machine was designed during an era when planners expected the river to deliver more than recent decades have consistently supplied. That is what makes 1,042 feet abnormal. Lake Mead was built to absorb variation. In wet years, it could store excess flow. In dry years, it could release water accumulated earlier. That is the purpose of a reservoir. A decline by itself is not evidence of failure. The system is supposed to move up and down. But a reservoir becomes vulnerable when recovery periods are too weak, too short, or too infrequent to rebuild what repeated dry years remove. The danger is not only the low point. It is the failure to regain distance from that point. A good snow year can lift the reservoirs and reduce immediate risk. It can also create the illusion that the underlying imbalance has disappeared. Then another weak runoff season arrives. Deliveries continue. Evaporation continues, and the recently gained elevation begins to drain away. The number moves down again, but now the system has less time before the next negotiation, the next shortage determination, and the next infrastructure threshold. 1,042 feet is therefore not merely a location on the dam wall, it is stored time. Each additional foot can provide managers with more room to negotiate, conserve, move water between years, and prepare infrastructure. Each lost foot compresses that time. Yet even this does not reveal the most important number. The lake would be lower without the water that farms, cities, tribes, and agencies have agreed not to consume. The elevation on the dashboard already includes those interventions. What appears to be storage is partly avoided use. What appears to be a physical level is also a record of contracts, payments, sacrifice, and temporary restraint. The visible number tells us where the water is. The hidden number tells us why it has not fallen farther. The elevation tells us where Lake Mead is today. It does not tell us where the reservoir would be if thousands of water users had continued taking everything their existing schedules allowed. That difference is the hidden number. According to the Department of the Interior, 18 short-term conservation agreements in Arizona and California are expected to leave about 321,000 acre-feet of water in Lake Mead through the end of 2026. Federal officials estimate that this conserved volume could support nearly 5 feet of additional reservoir elevation compared with the level that would exist without those reductions. 5 feet may sound small beside the white mineral wall surrounding the lake, but near the current operating range, 5 feet is not decoration. It is distance from a deeper shortage tier. It is hydraulic head at Hoover Dam. It is stored water available for future releases. Most of all, it is time. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. To understand why, imagine removing those conservation agreements from the dashboard. The reservoir would not suddenly lose a solid block of water overnight. The missing volume would appear gradually as additional diversions, greater agricultural consumption, and water moving into canals instead of remaining in storage. Day by day, the difference might look insignificant, a fraction of an inch here, another fraction there. Over months, the avoided withdrawals accumulate. Eventually, the lake surface is several feet higher than it otherwise would have been. That phrase matters. Higher than it otherwise would have been is not the same as recovering. A person walking down a staircase more slowly is still moving downward. Conservation can reduce the speed of decline without reversing the direction. That is exactly why a reservoir can remain under serious pressure, even while large conservation programs are working. The programs may be preventing the worst line on the graph, not producing the good line viewers hope to see. An acre-foot is the volume needed to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. It equals roughly 326,000 gallons. 321,000 acre-feet, therefore represents more than 100 billion gallons. That comparison creates scale, but it can also create confusion. The water is not gathered into one visible new pool. It is distributed across fields, not fully irrigated, deliveries reduced, projects modified, and withdrawals that never occur. The conservation appears as absence. A canal gate stays closed longer, a field receives less irrigation. A city leaves previously banked water in the reservoir. A tribe or irrigation district changes the timing of a diversion. The lake rises relative to an invisible alternative. This is why conservation is harder to communicate than a storm. A storm can be seen moving across radar. Conserved water is measured against a future that did not happen. That creates the first difficult question. How do officials know the water was truly saved? The answer begins with a baseline. Managers estimate how much water a participant would normally have consumed without the agreement. They then compare that expected use with measured or verified consumption during the conservation period. The difference can be credited as system conservation. But a baseline is not a natural law. It depends on crop history, acreage, weather, irrigation practices, legal entitlements, delivery records, and assumptions about what would have occurred without payment. If a farmer planned to reduce planting anyway because prices were poor, paying for the same reduction may not produce entirely new savings. If a field receives less river water but pumps more groundwater, pressure may simply move from one system to another. If efficiency allows a farmer to deliver more water to plant roots but leaves less runoff returning to the river, the reduction in diversions may overstate the reduction in total consumption. This does not mean the agreements are imaginary. It means conservation must be measured carefully. The key quantity is often consumptive use, the portion of diverted water that is consumed by crops, cities, industry, or evaporation, and does not quickly return to the river. Consider an irrigated field. Water enters through a canal. Some is used by the crop and released into the air through transpiration. Some evaporates from soil and irrigation equipment. Some may seep downward or run off and eventually return to the river system. If a project reduces the original diversion, Not all of that reduced amount automatically becomes new water in Lake Mead. Managers must estimate how much water was genuinely prevented from being consumed. The difference between diversion and consumption is one of the least visible numbers in Western water policy, yet it determines whether an agreement changes the reservoir balance or only changes where water moves. The same complexity appears in cities. Las Vegas has achieved major reductions in per-person water use through turf removal, reuse, pricing, and restrictions. Much of the indoor water used in the Las Vegas Valley is treated and returned to Lake Mead, allowing the region to receive return flow credits. Outdoor water is different. Water sprayed onto grass or lost through evaporation generally does not return to the reservoir. Removing decorative turf can therefore reduce consumptive use more directly than asking residents to shorten a shower whose wastewater is largely captured and recycled. The headline may say a city saved water. The operational question is, what kind of use disappeared, and whether that water remained available to the system. Conservation is not a single behavior. It is a chain of accounting tied to physical movement. Agricultural conservation is equally varied. A farmer may temporarily leave land unplanted. An irrigation district may reduce deliveries. A grower may switch crops, improve scheduling, or accept payment to consume less water during a defined period. Each choice has a different water effect and a different human cost. Fallowing land can create measurable savings, but it can also reduce work for equipment operators, harvest crews, suppliers, and local businesses. Switching crops may lower water use, but permanent orchards cannot simply be turned off for a season without damage. Efficiency improvements may protect production while reducing withdrawals, but they can change return flows downstream. The water retained in Lake Mead can therefore be traced into a rural economy, from the reservoir into a contract, from the contract into an irrigation schedule, from the irrigation schedule into a field, from the field into wages, food production, and the tax base of a small community. The water remains in the lake, but the adjustment does not remain there. Federal funding changes that decision. Many recent conservation agreements have used money authorized to respond to drought and stabilize the Colorado River system. The payment recognizes a basic fact. Water users are being asked to give up something with economic value for the benefit of a much larger network. Paying for temporary reductions can move faster than rewriting permanent rights. It can produce real water savings during a dangerous period. It can also avoid the conflict that would follow mandatory cuts imposed without compensation. But payment creates an expiration date. When the program ends, the economic incentive may end with it. A farmer who reduced irrigation for 3 years may return to previous production. A district that conserved under a federal contract may again exercise its legal entitlement. A city may continue permanent efficiency projects, but temporary water left in the reservoir can once again become available for delivery. This is the central weakness, hidden inside the 5 feet. The additional elevation is physically real, but part of the behavior supporting it is temporary. The water is stored. The restraint may not be. That does not make buying time pointless. Time is one of the most valuable resources in an emergency. 5 feet can allow planners to complete new pumping facilities, negotiate operating rules, protect power generation, test conservation methods, and avoid crossing a critical threshold during one exceptionally dry season. Time can prevent rushed decisions that produce greater harm. It can allow a wet year to arrive before the system reaches a dangerous level. It can create space for states, tribes, Mexico, cities, and agricultural districts to reach an agreement. The problem begins when temporary protection is mistaken for structural repair. A bridge held up by emergency supports is safer than a bridge without them, but the supports are not the same as rebuilding the damaged span. The Colorado River Basin has conserved millions of acre-feet through shortage reductions, voluntary agreements, urban efficiency, tribal partnerships, agricultural programs, and water stored under different accounting categories. Those efforts have materially improved reservoir conditions compared with scenarios in which demand continued unchecked. Yet the long-term arithmetic remains difficult. The river must support tens of millions of people, major agricultural regions, tribal communities, ecosystems, hydropower facilities, and obligations across an international border. Meanwhile, evaporation removes water from broad reservoir surfaces, warming increases losses from soil and vegetation, and runoff can decline, even when snowfall totals do not appear catastrophic. Conservation is pushing against those forces. It is not erasing them. And there is another hidden distinction. Water saved during a particular year may protect elevation now, without guaranteeing supply later. Once conserved, water becomes part of the common reservoir. Its future depends on operating rules. Who receives credit for it? Can it be withdrawn later? Is it dedicated to system protection, or does it remain connected to the participant who created it? Does it prevent a shortage declaration for everyone, including users who did not conserve? These accounting questions are not technical distractions. They determine whether cooperation is rewarded and whether users will participate again. A city or irrigation district is more likely to leave water in Lake Mead if it trusts that the water will not simply enable another user to take more. The physical reservoir is shared. The incentives are not automatically shared. That is why the headline number cannot be understood without the legal ledger behind it. Lake Mead, near 1,042 feet, contains mountain runoff, releases from Lake Powell, return flows from cities, unused allocations, mandatory reductions, voluntary conservation, and water protected by temporary federal agreements. These sources mix in the reservoir until 1 gallon cannot be distinguished from another. On paper, however, every category can carry a different history and a different claim. The lake looks like one body of water. The operating system sees layers of obligation. But that is not the strangest part. The 5 feet attributed to short-term conservation is not a wall separating safety from disaster. It is a moving buffer inside a system whose inflow, demand, evaporation, and rules continue changing. A stronger runoff year could preserve that buffer. Another dry sequence could consume it. New agreements could expand it. Expiring payments could narrow it. The lake may rise while the long-term problem remains unresolved, or fall, even though conservation is preventing a much steeper decline. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a system buying time faster than it is buying certainty. And to see whether that purchased time can become lasting protection, we have to follow the mechanism from a promise on paper to the exact place where water is prevented from leaving the river. The mechanism begins long before a single drop is left behind in Lake Mead. It begins with a decision about use. Somewhere in the lower Colorado River basin, a farmer, a city, a tribal government, an irrigation district, or a water agency holds the legal ability to divert water. Under normal conditions, that water would enter a canal, a pipe, a treatment plant, a field, or an industrial system. Under a conservation agreement, part of that expected use is reduced, delayed, or avoided. The visible result is simple. More water remains in storage. The hidden mechanism is not simple at all. It is a chain that moves from law into measurement, from measurement into behavior, and from behavior into the reservoir. To understand why conservation can buy time without solving the whole problem, the first distinction is between water that is diverted and water that is consumed. Those two numbers are not the same. A diversion is water removed from the river or reservoir and delivered somewhere else. Consumptive use is the portion that does not return quickly to the river system because it is absorbed by crops, evaporated into the atmosphere, incorporated into products, or otherwise removed from immediate reuse. A farm may divert 10 units of water, but some portion can drain back through soil, canals, or runoff and eventually return downstream. A city may withdraw water for indoor use, treat it, and send much of it back to the reservoir. If managers count only the initial withdrawal, they can mistake movement for loss. The mechanism therefore begins with accounting for what would truly have been consumed. That is where the baseline enters. A baseline is the estimated amount of water a participant would have used without the agreement. Officials examine historical records, planted acreage, crop type, weather, irrigation efficiency, delivery schedules, and previous consumption. Then they compare that expected use with what actually occurred. The difference becomes the proposed conservation volume. This sounds like subtraction. In practice, it is an argument about an invisible alternative. Nobody can directly observe the year that would have happened without the payment. Managers must construct it from evidence. If the baseline is too high, the agreement may receive credit for water that was never likely to be used. If it is too low, the participant may not be fully credited for real sacrifice. The entire program depends on making that unseen comparison credible. This is why meters, satellite images, field inspections, crop reports, and delivery records matter. The contract creates an obligation. Measurement turns that obligation into water. Consider a farm district receiving Colorado River water through a canal. Before the growing season, a farmer normally chooses which fields to plant and how much water each crop will require. A conservation agreement can alter that sequence. A field may be left fallow. A lower water crop may replace a more water-intensive one. Irrigation may be reduced during part of the season. In some cases, a farmer may be paid not to plant at all. The mechanism moves from a federal appropriation into a signed agreement, from the agreement into the district delivery schedule, from the schedule into a canal gate that opens less often, from the canal gate into soil that receives less water, from the soil into lower crop production or a different crop, and from that, reduced consumption into a larger volume remaining in the river system. By the time the effect appears as a slightly higher elevation at Lake Mead, the economic and biological changes have already occurred hundreds of miles away. This is not water created. It is water not removed. That difference is the spine of the mechanism. Urban conservation works through a different path. In southern Nevada, indoor water use is often treated and returned to Lake Mead. Outdoor use is more likely to be consumed through evaporation and plant transpiration. That makes a square foot of decorative grass more important than it first appears. Water applied to that grass enters soil, leaves through plant surfaces, or evaporates under desert heat. Much of it does not return to the reservoir. When a city removes non-functional turf, restricts irrigation days, repairs leaks, or changes pricing, it reduces the portion of water that disappears from the immediate system. The mechanism moves from a local ordinance into a landscaping decision, from the landscaping decision into fewer sprinkler cycles, from fewer sprinkler cycles into less evaporation, from less evaporation into lower consumptive use, and from lower consumptive use into water that remains available for the basin. The lawn disappears from one property. The effect appears as a fraction of an inch in a reservoir. This is why conservation can feel disconnected from the lake. The action is local, the benefit is distributed. Tribal conservation agreements can add another layer. Tribal nations hold significant water rights across the basin, but not every tribe has infrastructure to use the full amount legally recognized. Some agreements allow tribes to conserve water, lease it, or leave it in the system under carefully negotiated terms. The physical effect may resemble other conservation. The legal meaning does not. These agreements intersect with sovereignty, unresolved claims, economic development, and a history in which many tribal communities were excluded from decisions about a river crossing their lands. Water left in Lake Mead under a tribal agreement is not simply unused water. It may represent a government choosing to contribute to system stability while seeking compensation, recognition, and control over how that contribution is counted. The mechanism therefore moves through politics as well as pipes. Then comes verification. A conservation promise is not enough. Officials must determine whether the reduced use actually occurred and whether it produced a real system benefit. For agricultural programs, that can mean confirming acreage, crop conditions, irrigation deliveries, and expected evapotranspiration. For cities, it can mean comparing metered use, return flows, population, weather, and long-term trends. For infrastructure projects, it can mean estimating how much water a lined canal, repaired leak, or upgraded treatment system will save over time. Each method contains uncertainty. Satellite data can show whether a field is green, but not perfectly measure every gallon consumed. Delivery records can show how much water entered a district, but not exactly how much returned downstream. Weather can change crop demand. Economic conditions can change planting plans. A conservation program must separate the effect of the agreement from everything else happening at the same time. The warning does not need exaggeration. The mechanism is already complicated enough. And there is a second problem hidden inside efficiency. Improving irrigation does not always create the same amount of system water that appears in the diversion record. Suppose a farmer replaces an older system with equipment that sends more water directly to plant roots. The farm may divert less water, but if the old system allowed significant seepage or runoff to return to the river, then part of the apparent savings may have been water that was already re-entering the system downstream. The farm becomes more efficient. The basin may save less than the reduction in the original diversion suggests. This does not mean efficiency is useless. It means the relevant question is not only how much water was delivered, but how much was consumed and how much returned. The river responds to the full balance, not the first number on the meter. Fallowing can create clearer savings because the crop is not planted and evapotranspiration is reduced. But that mechanism transfers load into the community. A field that does not use water may also not need seed, fertilizer, equipment repair, trucking, seasonal labor, or processing. The water remains in the reservoir. The economic activity does not remain in the town. Conservation therefore moves through two systems at once. It protects the hydrologic system by reducing demand. It can stress the social system by reducing production. That trade-off is why temporary payments matter. They do not merely purchase water, they purchase participation and help absorb the cost of changing behavior. Without compensation, the same reduction might arrive through mandatory cuts, financial loss, or legal conflict. Yet payment introduces the next weak link. The mechanism lasts only as long as the incentive, the contract, or the permanent change behind it. A removed lawn may save water for years. A repaired municipal leak may create lasting efficiency. A field left fallow for one season may return to full irrigation when the agreement ends. A city may bank water temporarily and withdraw it later. A district may conserve under one federal program, but decline to participate in the next. The water saved this year is real. The behavior producing the savings may be temporary. This is how conservation buys time. It lowers demand during a dangerous period, holds the reservoir above where it would otherwise be, and gives negotiators more months or years to create a durable operating framework. But conservation does not control precipitation. It cannot force snow to remain in the mountains. It cannot prevent heat from drying soil before runoff begins. It cannot replace the inflow that never reaches Lake Powell. It changes one side of the balance sheet. The river still controls the other. Think of Lake Mead as the final visible account in a long sequence of transactions. Snow falls in the mountains. Some evaporates or enters dry soil. The remainder becomes runoff. Lake Powell captures part of it. Glen Canyon Dam releases part of that storage. Tributaries add or remove water through diversions and return flows. Lower basin users take deliveries. Cities return some indoor water. Farms consume part of what they receive. Conservation agreements reduce selected withdrawals. Evaporation removes water from the reservoir surface. Hoover Dam releases water downstream. By the time the elevation changes, thousands of processes have already acted on the same river. The reservoir does not rise because one conservation project is dramatic. It rises relative to the alternative because many small absences accumulate. One canal gate stays closed. One field is not planted. One lawn is removed. One agency leaves a portion of its allocation in storage. One tribe signs an agreement. One city lowers outdoor demand. Each action is too small to explain the lake alone. Together, they change the curve. But the mechanism contains a final warning. The closer the system moves toward critical thresholds, the more valuable each conserved acre-foot becomes. At higher reservoir levels, One conservation agreement may seem like a modest contribution to a vast storage pool. Near 1,042 feet, the same water can protect operating margin, delay a deeper shortage tier, preserve hydraulic head, and reduce the chance that emergency decisions must be made under pressure. Scarcity changes the meaning of the same volume. Water that once looked marginal becomes structural. The danger is not that conservation is failing. The danger is that conservation may be working exactly as designed, while the broader system continues to lose ground. The lake can be higher because of the agreements, and still be too low for comfort. The contracts can be successful and still be temporary. The measurements can be accurate and still depend on assumptions. The reservoir can hold the saved water, while the communities producing that saving absorb the cost. The map shows a lake. The mechanism runs through law, money, canals, crops, streets, meters, pumps, and people. And the next question is no longer how conservation works in theory. It is what this mechanism feels like when it enters one household, one field, one paycheck, and one decision about what can survive another season. The mechanism becomes real at the edge of a field before the sun is fully above the horizon. A farmer in the lower Colorado River Basin stands beside an irrigation ditch and looks at two things that do not appear on the same map. One is the water available under a delivery schedule. The other is the money needed to carry a farm through another season. The conservation agreement asks for a decision that sounds simple from a federal office. Use less water. On the ground, that sentence immediately divides into harder questions. Which field receives less? Which crop is not planted? Which trees can survive reduced irrigation? Which workers will still be needed? Which loan payment comes due before the conservation check arrives? And how much of the water saved here will truly remain in Lake Mead rather than disappear somewhere else in the system? The farmer does not experience reservoir policy as an elevation graph. The farmer experiences it as soil moisture, seed orders, fuel bills, wages, and a gate that may not open. Imagine a farm growing crops under intense desert heat. The planting plan was built months earlier around expected deliveries, market prices, labor availability, and the biological needs of each crop. Some crops can be skipped for 1 year, others cannot. A field planted with an annual crop can be left fallow, although the soil may still require management to control dust and weeds. A permanent orchard is different. Trees represent years of investment. Their roots, canopy, and future production depend on continued water. Reducing irrigation too sharply does not pause the orchard. It damages it. The conservation mechanism therefore enters the farm through choice, but the available choices are not equal. A payment that works for one field may be impossible for another. The decision begins outside the body, in a reservoir hundreds of miles away. Then it moves into the canal schedule. From the canal schedule into the soil, from the soil into the plant, from the plant into the worker, and from the worker into the household. A field left unplanted needs fewer hours of tractor operation. It needs less fertilizer, less harvesting labor, fewer boxes, fewer truck movements, and less work at a processing facility. The conserved water remains in the river system, but the missing economic activity travels through town. A mechanic sees fewer repairs. A supplier sells less equipment. A seasonal worker loses weeks of employment. A restaurant serves fewer lunches. A school district may eventually feel a smaller local tax base. None of these consequences means the conservation agreement is wrong. It means water savings have a pathway. The pathway does not end at the reservoir. This is where a broad phrase like agricultural reduction becomes dangerously incomplete. Agriculture uses most of the water consumed in the lower Colorado River system, so major savings are difficult to achieve without involving farms. But agricultural water is not used in an empty landscape. It produces food, income, habitat, and community stability. Cutting use can protect Lake Mead while placing concentrated pressure on places with fewer alternatives. The water benefit is spread across millions of people. The economic cost may fall on one district, one town, or one family. That imbalance is one reason compensation exists. The payment is intended to move part of the system-wide benefit back toward the person accepting the immediate loss. Yet the payment does not remove uncertainty. A farmer must decide whether the agreement covers lost revenue, future soil recovery, equipment costs, and the risk that a temporary reduction becomes the beginning of a permanent shift away from farming. The larger question is not only whether the payment is enough, it is whether the community believes the program is a bridge or an exit. Now follow the same acre-foot into a city. In the Las Vegas Valley, a household may never see the canal gate or the federal contract. The mechanism enters through a water bill, an irrigation schedule, a rebate for removing grass, or a notice that decorative turf can no longer be maintained in the same way. A resident looks at a front yard that has been green for years and sees landscaping. The water system sees consumptive use. Much of the water used indoors can be treated and returned to Lake Mead. Water spread across a lawn under desert sun is more likely to leave through evaporation and plant transpiration. That makes outdoor use a direct target. The city pays residents to replace grass with desert landscaping. Sprinklers run fewer days. Leaks are repaired. Golf courses are assigned budgets. New developments face efficiency standards. The change seems local, almost cosmetic. But the mechanism moves from the yard into the reservoir. Less water leaves the distribution system. Less disappears into the atmosphere. More remains available as a return flow credit or as water never withdrawn. The household experiences conservation as a change in routine. The utility experiences it as reduced demand. Lake Mead experiences it as a decline that is slightly slower than it would have been. But the human pathway is not equal in the city either. A homeowner with money can redesign a yard, install efficient fixtures, and absorb a higher rate. A renter may have no control over landscaping or plumbing. A low-income household can reduce use and still struggle with a fixed charge. A family in an older neighborhood may face leaks in pipes they cannot afford to replace. Conservation rules that appear neutral can place different burdens on different people. The body does not experience drought as a policy category. It experiences it through heat, work, cost, and access. A landscaping worker spends the day removing turf under extreme temperatures. A maintenance employee adjusts irrigation during overnight hours. A construction crew installs new lines beneath streets. The water savings may protect the system, but the labor required to create those savings still moves through human bodies. Then the mechanism reaches a tribal community, where the pathway can be even more complicated. Many tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin hold senior water rights or unresolved claims, yet some communities still lack the infrastructure needed to deliver reliable water to homes and businesses. A tribal government may agree to conserve or lease water for the benefit of the wider system, while some residents continue living with inadequate plumbing or expensive hauled water. That apparent contradiction is not evidence that the water is unneeded. It is evidence that legal entitlement, physical access, and economic opportunity are not the same thing. A conservation agreement can provide revenue, support infrastructure, and strengthen tribal authority over water decisions. It can also place a community inside negotiations shaped by a century of exclusion. The human pathway therefore passes through sovereignty. Water left in Lake Mead may represent not only reduced consumption, but a government deciding how to use an asset that previous institutions often ignored or controlled. The same acre-foot can carry physical value, legal value, and historical weight. By afternoon, the farmer checks the soil again. The surface may look dry, but the important moisture lies below. If irrigation is reduced too early, a crop may fail to establish. If it is reduced too late, the intended water savings may disappear. Timing becomes as important as volume. The agreement may specify a seasonal reduction, but the plant responds hour by hour to heat, wind, humidity, and soil conditions. Conservation enters biology. A policy written in acre-feet becomes stress inside a leaf. Stomata, close to reduce water loss. Growth slows. Yield changes. The farm manager responds with another decision: irrigate now and risk missing the conservation target, or wait and risk losing the crop. The reservoir is far away, but the pressure is present in the field, from the atmosphere into the soil, from the soil into the plant, from the plant into income, from income into food, rent, medicine, and the next planting season. This is the human pathway that a reservoir graph cannot show. There is also a psychological pathway. Years of repeated shortage planning change how people make long-term decisions. A farmer may delay buying equipment because future deliveries are uncertain. A city may raise rates to finance new infrastructure. A family may question whether a community will have the same economic base 10 years from now. A water manager may avoid promising supply for new development. Conservation is designed to preserve options, but the need for conservation can itself narrow confidence. Every temporary agreement carries an unspoken question about what happens after it expires. Will the river recover? Will another payment program replace it? Will mandatory reductions arrive? Will the same users be asked to conserve again? Uncertainty becomes its own cost, and yet the absence of conservation would also move through people. A faster decline at Lake Mead could bring deeper mandatory cuts, reduced hydropower, higher energy costs, greater pressure on urban supplies, and emergency negotiations conducted with less time. The choice is not between sacrifice and no sacrifice. It is often between an organized sacrifice now and a more chaotic one later. That is why the agreements matter. They convert part of an uncontrolled physical risk into a negotiated human decision. They allow someone to be paid for changing behavior before the reservoir forces change without consent. But the system cannot rely forever on the same people accepting the same burden. If conservation becomes the permanent method for balancing the river, then the distribution of cost becomes a structural question. Who gives up water first? Who is paid? Who is protected by senior rights? Who has the infrastructure to conserve? Who receives credit? Who loses employment? Who pays higher rates? Who can adapt without leaving? The lake does not answer those questions. It only records the result. By evening, the canal may carry less water than it once did. The field may remain dry. The city sprinklers may stay off. A tribal government may have completed another round of negotiations. Somewhere inside the federal accounting system, the avoided consumption is added to a conservation total. Weeks later, that total becomes a fraction of Lake Mead elevation. The public sees a number near 1,042 feet. The people inside the mechanism see decisions that cannot be reduced to a single line. This is not just a shrinking reservoir. This is a system buying time through human choices. And those choices are not weightless. The next danger appears where those choices meet a piece of infrastructure that cannot negotiate, cannot conserve by choice, and cannot work around the loss of water pressure. That weak point is the shrinking hydraulic head behind Hoover Dam. The weak point is not the whole dam. The weak point is the shrinking column of water that makes the dam useful. Hoover Dam is often imagined as the strongest object in the story, a wall of concrete built to hold back a river and generate power for the Southwest. The structure is massive. The machinery is engineered for difficult conditions. The intake towers, penstocks, turbines, generators, transformers, and transmission lines form one of the most recognized pieces of water and energy infrastructure in the United States. But the system depends on something less visible than concrete. It depends on vertical distance. Water stored high above the power plant carries potential energy. When that water descends through the intake system and moves toward the turbines, gravity converts elevation into pressure and pressure into motion. The greater the difference between the reservoir surface and the turbine, the greater the hydraulic head. That head is the force behind the electricity. As Lake Mead falls, Hoover Dam does not lose its concrete strength, it loses leverage. Picture a water tower above a neighborhood. The tower creates pressure because the water is elevated. Lower the water level inside the tower, and the pressure available to move water through pipes declines. Hoover Dam operates on a much larger and more complex scale, but the principle is similar. Water enters the intake towers, travels through enormous pipes called penstocks, and strikes turbine runners below. The spinning turbines drive generators, converting mechanical energy into electricity. The volume of water matters. The height from which it falls matters too. At lower elevations, the same acre-foot of water can produce less electricity because the pressure difference is smaller. The reservoir still contains water. The dam still releases water. The weak point is the declining energy value of each release. This is why minimum power pool is not the only important threshold. Federal operating documents place the approximate minimum power pool for Hoover Dam near 950 feet above sea level. Lake Mead, near 1,042 feet, remains well above that level. A careless reading could therefore conclude that hydropower is not an immediate concern. But infrastructure does not move from perfect performance to total failure in one step. Capacity falls before generation stops. Efficiency changes before the final threshold arrives. Certain combinations of units become harder to operate. Maintenance choices become more constrained. The amount of electricity available during high-demand periods declines. The system weakens gradually, which means the warning appears while the lights are still on. Reclamation has already adjusted the estimated generating capability of Hoover Dam as reservoir elevations have fallen. The generators were designed for a range of operating conditions, and modifications have helped them perform under lower head. Yet engineering cannot eliminate gravity. When the reservoir surface drops, the pressure available at the turbines changes. No software update can replace that missing height. No conservation campaign can make 1 foot of water create the same head as 20 feet. The dam can adapt. It cannot negotiate with physics. The consequence moves outward through the grid. Hoover Power is sold to public agencies, municipalities, irrigation districts, tribal utilities, and other customers across the region. Its value is not limited to the number of kilowatt-hours produced over a year. Hydropower can respond quickly. Operators can increase or decrease output to help match electricity supply with changing demand. That flexibility becomes especially useful when solar generation falls in the evening, when temperatures remain high after sunset, or when another power plant unexpectedly goes offline. A reduced Hoover capacity does not mean the Southwest immediately loses electricity. Other generators, transmission lines, batteries, and markets can supply power. But replacement power may be more expensive, less flexible, farther away, or more carbon intensive. The weak point is not a guaranteed blackout. It is the loss of margin before a difficult hour arrives. That margin matters because the Colorado River system consumes electricity as well as producing it. The Central Arizona project moves water hundreds of miles and lifts it thousands of feet towards central and southern Arizona. Pumping water uphill requires enormous amounts of energy. Municipal systems pump water from intakes, through treatment plants, into elevated storage, and across expanding service areas. Farms use pumps to move water through irrigation networks. Wastewater plants treat and return flows. When hydropower becomes less available or more expensive, the water system can face higher energy costs. At the same time, the energy system loses a flexible resource. The river generates power, and the region uses power to move the river. That loop is one of the hidden connections behind the elevation at Lake Mead. The lake falls, hydraulic head declines, power value weakens, pumping costs continue. Water agencies face pressure to conserve, invest, and maintain service at the same time. The map shows a reservoir. The weak point appears in the relationship between water height and electricity demand. Then there are the intake towers. Hoover Dam has 4 large intake towers, 2 on the Arizona side and 2 on the Nevada side. Water enters through gates at different elevations before moving toward the power plant and downstream outlets. As the reservoir declines, the available intake configuration changes. The system retains significant operating range, but each lower level narrows the choices available to managers. Lower water can also carry different temperatures, sediment conditions, and water quality characteristics. The immediate headline may be elevation, but infrastructure receives water as pressure, chemistry, temperature, and flow. A turbine does not experience drought as a graph. It experiences drought as altered operating conditions. A transformer does not see a reservoir. It sees the electrical output delivered by the generators. A utility does not see the white bathtub ring. It sees a contract, a capacity forecast, and the cost of replacing power that may no longer be available at the same level. The weak point, therefore, travels beyond the dam. Suppose a hot evening arrives across the southwest. Air conditioners remain active after sunset because buildings have absorbed heat all day. Solar output declines quickly. Grid operators need resources that can respond. Hoover Dam may still provide power, but at a lower reservoir elevation, its maximum output is reduced compared with the output available under a higher head. If transmission from another region is constrained, gas plants are undergoing maintenance, or demand exceeds forecasts, the reduced hydro margin becomes more important. Again, this does not prove that Lake Mead will cause a blackout. That would be a false chain of certainty. It shows how one physical loss can narrow several options at once. System risk is often created not by one component failing, but by multiple components losing flexibility during the same hour. The same principle applies to water delivery in southern Nevada. Las Vegas does not depend on shallow shoreline pumps. The Southern Nevada Water Authority built deep intake infrastructure and a low lake-level pumping station intended to maintain access under elevations far below the current surface. Those investments are a major reason that a dramatic drop in Lake Mead does not translate directly into a dry household tap. The city moved its intake weak point downward. But moving a weak point is not the same as eliminating dependence. The pumping station requires electricity. The treatment system requires stable water quality. The region still depends on legal access to Colorado River water. Infrastructure protects the physical ability to withdraw water, but it does not guarantee the amount available under future shortage rules. The intake can reach the water. The larger system must still decide who may use it. This distinction is crucial because dramatic images of exposed shoreline can produce two opposite mistakes. The first is panic, the idea that cities are days away from running out. The second is complacency, the idea that deep intakes make the reservoir level irrelevant. Both are wrong. The infrastructure has created resilience. It has also created a new set of dependencies involving energy, maintenance, financing, and legal supply. The weak point is not simply whether a pipe touches water. It is whether the entire chain behind that pipe can continue operating under lower storage and tighter allocation. Agriculture has its own small components. A canal turnout, a pumping station, a gate, or a scheduling office can become the place where basin-wide shortage enters a local system. Under normal conditions, an irrigation district coordinates deliveries across hundreds or thousands of acres. Water arrives according to crop needs, legal priorities, and canal capacity. A conservation agreement changes that schedule. A shortage declaration may reduce the available supply. A lower delivery can require more precise timing because there is less room for error. If a pump fails during a narrow irrigation window, crops may face damage before repairs are completed. If electricity becomes more expensive, the cost of lifting or pressurizing water rises. If a canal loses water through seepage, the loss becomes more significant when total supply is smaller. The weak point is not always the main reservoir. It can be the small machine that must function perfectly because the backup volume has disappeared. Marinas and recreation facilities reveal the same pattern in a more visible way. As Lake Mead falls, floating docks must be moved. Boat ramps can become too short or too shallow. Roads and utility lines may need to be extended. A few feet of elevation can determine whether a facility remains usable. These effects may appear secondary beside municipal water and hydropower, but recreation supports local businesses, park operations, emergency response, and regional employment. A marina does not fail because the entire lake vanishes. It fails when a ramp, connection, anchoring system, or access road no longer matches the shoreline. The weak point is a small component left behind by moving water. That is the pattern across the system. Infrastructure was built around ranges. Intake gates assume water will remain within certain elevations. Turbines assume a range of hydraulic head. Canals assume predictable deliveries. Pumps assume power will be available at a manageable cost. Marinas assume shorelines will not retreat faster than facilities can be moved. Emergency rules assume negotiations will produce new decisions before old protections expire. The reservoir does not need to reach dead pool to challenge these assumptions. It only needs to move far enough that systems designed with comfortable margins begin operating near their lower boundaries. The danger is not only the threshold, it is the repeated approach to the threshold. Repeated low water changes, maintenance schedules, investment priorities, insurance, staffing, and institutional behavior. A water agency spends money on deeper intakes instead of another project. A utility prepares for reduced hydro allocations. A farmer delays planting. A marina moves again. A federal operator rewrites another forecast. Each adjustment may succeed. Together, they reveal a system devoting more resources to preserving basic function. This is not collapse. It is compression. And compression creates sensitivity. A small forecast error matters more. A delayed repair matters more. A dry month matters more. A failed negotiation matters more. When there is abundant storage, the reservoir absorbs mistakes and surprises. When storage is low, surprises travel farther. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the small amount of remaining room between an ordinary problem and an operational consequence. That is why the hydraulic head behind Hoover Dam matters beyond electricity. It is a physical measurement of lost flexibility. The water surface falls, the pressure declines, the power margin narrows, and the system becomes more dependent on every other component working as expected. Conservation agreements can slow that process. Deep intakes can protect access. Modified turbines can extend generation. New rules can distribute reductions. But none of these measures changes the historical evidence already left along the canyon walls. The basin has approached dangerous elevations before, and the record shows what happens when temporary recovery is mistaken for permanent repair. To understand the next risk, we have to return to the years when Lake Mead reached its modern low and ask which lessons the system absorbed and which lessons it postponed. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In the summer of 2022, Lake Mead fell into a range that had never been recorded in the modern operating history of the reservoir. Federal data placed the end of July elevation near 1,041 feet. In other words, the lake was almost exactly where it is now. The shoreline retreated, boat ramps closed, intake concerns became national headlines. The white mineral band widened across the canyon walls. But the most important evidence was not the image of a shrinking lake. It was the sequence of decisions that followed. The system had reached a point where old assumptions no longer produced comfortable answers. 1 year earlier, the Bureau of Reclamation had declared the first official shortage in the lower Colorado River Basin for calendar year 2022. That declaration triggered reduced deliveries to Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. Arizona absorbed the largest scheduled reduction, about 320,000 acre-feet. Nevada lost about 13,000 acre-feet. Mexico received about 50,000 acre-feet less under the international framework then in effect. The reductions did not mean household taps immediately stopped. They moved through priorities. Lower priority agricultural users, especially those dependent on the Central Arizona Project, faced some of the earliest and most significant effects. The shortage declaration was historic because the legal and operating system had crossed a line it had spent years trying to avoid. The reservoir had not failed. The contingency plan had activated. That distinction matters. A shortage declaration is evidence that preparation worked. Rules existed before the crisis reached the deepest physical thresholds. But it is also evidence that the conditions those rules were designed for were no longer hypothetical. A contingency had become an operating condition. In 2022, the Colorado River Basin was entering the 23rd year of a prolonged drought. Lake Mead and Lake Powell together held only a fraction of their combined capacity. The Bureau of Reclamation warned that low runoff and extreme heat were accelerating the decline. The problem was not one dry winter, it was accumulation. A weak snow year followed an earlier weak year. High temperatures increased evaporation and dried soils. dry soil absorbed more snowmelt before it could reach streams. Reservoir releases continued because cities, farms, tribes, ecosystems, and legal obligations still required water. The system was using stored water to replace missing runoff. That is what reservoirs are built to do. The warning appears when storage must perform that role repeatedly without sufficient recovery. The historical evidence is visible in the elevation record. At the beginning of 2022, Lake Mead stood near 1,067 feet. By the end of June, it was close to 1,043 feet. By the end of July, it had fallen to roughly 1,041 feet. In only 7 months, more than 25 feet of elevation disappeared. Not every foot represented the same volume, and summer declines are normal because demand and evaporation rise. But the speed and starting point changed the meaning. The reservoir was not falling from a high, comfortable level. It was falling from an already depleted one. Every additional foot brought the system closer to deeper shortage tiers, lower hydropower capacity, and narrower operating choices. The precedent, therefore, is not simply that Lake Mead has been this low before. It is that the lake can reach this level quickly when weak runoff, continued demand, and limited recovery align. The pattern in 2022 forced officials to consider actions that would once have sounded extreme. Reclamation called for basin states to conserve an additional 2 to 4 million acre-feet per year to protect critical reservoir elevations. That figure revealed the scale of the imbalance officials feared. It was far larger than ordinary municipal conservation campaigns. It approached a substantial share of annual lower basin use. Yet the states did not immediately produce a binding agreement for reductions at that scale. Negotiations continued, while the reservoirs remained low. The federal government explored emergency alternatives. Water users defended legal rights, economic interests, and community needs. The physical system continued moving, while the political system searched for a distribution of pain that could be accepted. This is one of the most important lessons from the precedent. A reservoir can decline faster than institutions can agree on who should respond. The hydrology does not wait for consensus, but history did not move in a straight line toward disaster. The winter that followed brought improved snowpack and runoff conditions. Lake Mead rose during 2023. Its end-of-year elevation recovered to around 1,068 feet. The increase was significant. It moved the reservoir away from the record low and created valuable operating space. Federal conservation programs, reduced releases, shortage measures, and favorable hydrology all contributed to a less dangerous position. This is exactly why the 2022 precedent must be used carefully. The system did not collapse. Hoover Dam did not stop generating. Las Vegas did not lose water service. The reservoirs responded when inflow improved and conservation reduced pressure. The evidence does not support a prophecy that every return to 1,042 feet must end in failure. It supports a different conclusion. Recovery is possible, but recovery can be temporary. Lake Mead rose after the historic low. Then the system entered another sequence of weak inflow and declining storage. The lake returned toward the same elevation only a few years later. That return is more revealing than the original record. A one-time low can be described as an extraordinary event. A repeated low suggests the operating range itself may be shifting. The lake recovered enough to create relief, but not enough to restore the large buffer that once separated normal operations from emergency planning. The system moved upward, then downward again, without rebuilding the old margin. This is not a simple collapse. It is a ratchet. Storage falls sharply, recovers partially, and remains vulnerable to the next dry sequence. Each cycle demands new intervention. Each cycle consumes political attention, federal funding, and public tolerance. Each cycle tests whether temporary measures can become permanent rules. The similarity between 2022 and 2026 is therefore clear. Lake Mead is again near 1,042 feet. Upstream inflow is again extremely weak. Federal managers are again altering releases and using emergency tools to protect critical infrastructure. Conservation agreements are again holding water in the system that would otherwise be consumed. The operating framework is again approaching a deadline, but the differences are equally important. In 2022, the first shortage declaration had only recently begun. Today, shortage operations are no longer new. Water agencies have several more years of experience with conservation, lower reservoir levels, and emergency planning. Southern Nevada has continued operating deep intake infrastructure. Turbine modifications and updated forecasting have expanded technical resilience. Federal funding has supported agreements capable of keeping hundreds of thousands of acre-feet in Lake Mead. The system is not entering the same moment with the same tools. It is entering a similar physical range, with more adaptation and less innocence. That can be both reassuring and disturbing. It is reassuring because institutions have learned. Cities have reduced demand. Agencies have built infrastructure. Farmers and tribes have entered conservation agreements. Reclamation has developed additional operational options. The reservoir is not being managed by people unaware of the risk. It is disturbing because those tools are already active, and the lake is still near 1,042 feet. The current elevation exists after shortage reductions, after urban conservation, after emergency federal spending, and after temporary agreements designed to preserve storage. The precedent tells us what the lake did before these newer interventions were fully expanded. The present tells us how much effort is now required to remain near the same level. This is the central historical comparison. The number is similar. The surrounding system is not. In 2022, the record low made the crisis visible. In 2026, returning to that range shows how difficult it is to create durable recovery. And there is an older precedent beneath the recent one. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 divided the river during a period when available records encouraged expectations of generous flow. Later research showed that long-term natural flow could be lower than the quantities embedded in legal expectations, especially when combined with modern demand and warming. The system was built around allocation numbers that did not always match the river's actual average supply. For decades, rapid growth and reservoir storage concealed part of that mismatch. Lake Mead and Lake Powell acted as buffers. They allowed the basin to carry water across years, absorb drought, and support development far from the river. The reservoirs did not create the imbalance. They delayed its visibility. The historical precedent is therefore larger than the low point of 2022. It is a century of relying on storage to reconcile a legal promise with a variable river. Another lesson comes from the way wet years are remembered. A strong snowpack produces dramatic images. Mountains turn white. Forecasts improve. Reservoir projections rise. Public concern fades. But snowpack is not the same as runoff. Temperature, soil moisture, dust on snow, wind, vegetation, and the timing of melt all influence how much water reaches the river. A basin can receive near normal snowfall and still produce below normal inflow if dry soils and warm conditions consume more of the melt. That mechanism has already appeared repeatedly. The atmosphere delivers snow, the landscape takes a larger share. The reservoir receives what remains. By the time the public sees a weak inflow number, much of the loss has already occurred across millions of acres. The precedent warns against treating one good winter as a reset. The system needs sustained recovery, not a single interruption in decline. The same warning applies to conservation. In the years after the 2022 low, temporary programs helped stabilize the reservoirs. That success is real. Without those programs, Lake Mead could be lower. But the historical record asks a harder question. What happens when the payments end? The basin has used emergency funding to secure voluntary reductions while post-2026 rules are negotiated. This resembles the use of reservoir storage itself. Both are buffers. Storage carries water across time. Funding carries cooperation across time. Neither is unlimited. If the system reaches the end of the current agreements without a durable method for matching use with supply, then the purchased time will have delayed the conflict rather than resolved it. History does not prove that outcome. It shows why the risk is credible. The 2022 crisis also exposed a distribution problem that remains unresolved. Not all water users hold the same priority. Not all communities have the same financial capacity. Not all reductions produce the same economic damage. A small percentage cut to a wealthy urban agency may be manageable through pricing, recycling, and infrastructure. A larger cut to a farming district may remove the foundation of a local economy. A tribal nation may possess senior rights, but lack pipes to deliver water to homes. Mexico participates through international agreements and faces its own agricultural and urban pressures. The river is physically connected, but vulnerability is uneven. The historical evidence shows that a shortage tier can assign volumes. It does not automatically produce justice. That question becomes more difficult as the required reductions grow. There is also a danger in using history too aggressively. The return to 1,042 feet does not mean 2022 is repeating exactly. The weather pattern is different. The reservoir release schedule is different. Conservation volumes are different. Infrastructure has changed. Forecasts contain uncertainty. The basin may receive improved precipitation. Negotiators may reach a stronger agreement. Demand could decline further. Historical precedent is not a script, it is a laboratory. It shows that the mechanism can produce real consequences under conditions resembling those now present. It tells us which connections deserve attention. It does not tell us the precise date or form of the next failure. The evidence line matters because exaggerated predictions can weaken public trust. In 2022, some coverage suggested that dead pool was almost inevitable. It was not. The reservoirs recovered. But the opposite conclusion is also unsupported. Recovery did not make the structural problem disappear. Lake Mead returned toward its former low within a few years, while the basin again relied on emergency action. The warning does not need certainty about catastrophe. The repeated pattern is enough. A system designed to recover between shocks is repeatedly using extraordinary measures to preserve operating space. That is the precedent. Not a single dramatic day, a cycle of decline, intervention, partial recovery, and renewed pressure. The walls around Lake Mead preserve the physical record. The shortage declarations preserve the administrative record. The conservation contracts preserve the financial record. Together, they tell the same story. The basin has already learned that waiting for the lake to approach a critical threshold leaves too little time. The unfinished lesson is whether action taken during the emergency can survive after the emergency funding and temporary agreements end. Lake Mead, near 1,042 feet, is not unprecedented. That is precisely what makes it important. The first arrival at this elevation was a warning. The return is a pattern, and the pattern expands beyond one reservoir, because the next operating system must manage not only drought, but a river whose old calendar, old averages, and old political compromises are all being tested at once. This is not only a reservoir decline, it is a deadline colliding with hydrology. The current operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead were designed as temporary guidelines, supported by later drought agreements and emergency actions. They were never meant to govern the river forever. Their central framework reaches its transition point after 2026, which means the basin is being asked to design a new operating system, while the old one is under extreme physical pressure. In January, the Bureau of Reclamation released a draft environmental review for post-2026 operations. The document examined different strategies for managing Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and shortages under a broad range of future river conditions. More than 18,000 public submissions followed. That level of response shows how many interests are attached to the same water. 7 basin states, 30 tribal nations, Mexico, federal agencies, agricultural districts, cities, power customers, environmental groups, and millions of residents all have reasons to care about where the reservoirs are allowed to fall and who must reduce use first. The river is one physical system. The negotiations are many political systems sharing it. The old calendar assumed that winter snow would build, spring runoff would refill storage, summer demand would draw it down, and reservoirs would carry enough water across dry years to preserve reliability. That sequence still occurs, but it no longer behaves with the same confidence. Snow can arrive and melt early. Dry soil can absorb a larger share before water reaches streams. Warm conditions can increase losses from land and reservoirs. A strong year can raise storage without restoring the long-term buffer. A weak year can erase several seasons of recovery. The calendar has not disappeared. It has become less dependable. That matters because almost every institution surrounding the river operates on schedules. Farmers choose crops before final runoff is known. Cities approve budgets before shortage levels are officially set. Power customers plan purchases before reservoir elevations reach their seasonal minimum. Federal managers publish studies based on probable hydrology, while acknowledging that actual conditions may move toward wetter or drier scenarios. Negotiators work under legal deadlines while the atmosphere follows none. The system was built to manage uncertainty. It is now being tested by uncertainty that persists for longer and carries greater consequences. Lake Mead, near 1,042 feet, is therefore not just evidence of low storage. It is evidence that the preparation calendar is compressing. Decisions once separated by years are being forced together. Managers must protect Lake Powell, preserve releases toward Lake Mead, maintain hydropower, honor legal commitments, support communities, and negotiate future rules at the same time. One action can improve one objective while weakening another. Reducing releases from Lake Powell protects the upstream reservoir and Glen Canyon Dam. The same action sends less water toward Lake Mead and reduces hydraulic head at Hoover Dam. Releasing water from Flaming Gorge supports Powell, but lowers storage in another part of the basin. Paying users to conserve protects Mead, but may reduce farm production or require temporary federal funding. There is no single lever that improves every part of the system. The new baseline is not simply a lower average reservoir elevation, it is a condition in which trade-offs appear sooner. Under higher storage, managers could make a mistake and allow the reservoirs to absorb part of it. Under lower storage, every decision travels farther. A forecast error can alter a shortage tier. A delayed agreement can expose another operating season. A dry spring can force an emergency release change. A conservation program ending on schedule can remove water savings just as another weak runoff year begins. The danger is not only one severe event, it is the loss of recovery time between events. This is a recovery failure repeated at basin scale. The system may survive each individual dry year, negotiation, heat wave, or infrastructure problem. The larger risk appears when it cannot rebuild margin before the next load arrives. That pattern is already visible in the movement of the two major reservoirs. Lake Mead and Lake Powell can rise after improved snow and conservation, but both remain vulnerable because the recovery is often partial. The basin escapes the immediate threshold, then returns to it. That creates a cycle of emergency attention. Federal funding arrives, agreements are signed, water is conserved, storage improves, public urgency fades. Then runoff weakens, demand continues, and the emergency tools are activated again. A system can function for years in this mode, but the cost rises. Temporary measures become expected. Communities make long-term plans around short-term programs. Agencies invest in infrastructure for lower elevations. Political negotiations begin from a position of fear rather than surplus. The extraordinary becomes administrative routine. The future operating rules must therefore answer more than how much water to release from one dam. They must decide how risk is shared when total supply is uncertain. Should reductions be tied primarily to reservoir elevations, measured river flow, percentages of use, legal priority, or a combination of these factors? How should upper basin and lower basin states divide responsibility when climate and hydrology reduce the amount available? How should tribal nations participate in decisions affecting water rights that were historically ignored or delayed? How should Mexico be included through international processes? How should conservation be rewarded so that one user does not leave water in storage only to see another user increase consumption? How should power production, ecosystems, recreation, and water quality be considered alongside deliveries? These are not questions that engineering alone can answer. Concrete can hold water. Turbines can generate electricity. Pumps can move supply. None can decide what fairness looks like under shortage. The system expansion reaches beyond the Southwest because the Colorado River supports agricultural production distributed across the country. Water delivered to fields in Arizona and California becomes vegetables, forage, livestock products, and income. A reduction that protects Lake Mead can eventually appear in food prices, employment, or changes in where crops are grown. Urban water decisions influence housing and development across some of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the United States. Hydropower changes affect public utilities and irrigation districts. Tribal water settlements influence economic development and basic household access. The reservoir is regional. Its consequences move nationally, and the pattern is not unique to the Colorado River. Water systems around the world were designed around historical ranges of rainfall, snowmelt, demand, and population. Reservoirs, drainage networks, farms, power plants, and legal agreements contain assumptions about when water arrives and how much time exists between extremes. When the climate calendar shifts, infrastructure does not move automatically. A dam remains where it was built. A crop remains tied to a season. A city remains connected to a particular intake. A treaty remains written in fixed language. The physical world changes first. Institutions follow later. Lake Mead is showing that delay in real time, but this does not mean the basin has no options. Demand has already declined in several major cities, even as populations grew. Reuse, turf removal, leak reduction, pricing, conservation agreements, improved forecasting, and deeper infrastructure have expanded resilience. Agricultural districts have demonstrated that large volumes can be conserved under negotiated programs. Tribal governments are playing a larger role in basin planning. Federal agencies are evaluating operating strategies across a wider range of hydrology than earlier rules considered. The system is adapting. The question is whether adaptation can become durable before repeated emergencies consume the remaining margin. A strong post-2026 framework would not need to predict every future snowpack. It would need to function across uncertainty. It would need clear triggers, measurable reductions, protection for critical infrastructure, credible conservation accounting, and a distribution of costs that participants can sustain. It would need to recognize that one wet year is not recovery, and one dry year is not destiny. Most of all, it would need to reduce use before the reservoirs approach physical crisis, not after. That is the future echo inside today's elevation. 1,042 feet is a present measurement, but it is also a test of rules that do not yet fully exist. The conservation agreements are holding back part of the decline while negotiators work. They are creating a narrow bridge between the current operating system and the next one. The bridge is real. It is also temporary. If the basin reaches the other side with enforceable, flexible, and broadly accepted rules, the purchase time will have served its purpose. If negotiations fail, the same water will still have delayed damage. But the system will face the next dry sequence with fewer temporary tools and the same unresolved conflict. The lake is not only storing water, it is storing the remaining opportunity to decide deliberately. And before that opportunity is described as either salvation or failure, the final step is to draw the evidence line clearly, separating what the data proves from what fear, politics, and wishful thinking merely suggest. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Mead is near 1,042 feet. Upstream inflow has been exceptionally weak. Conservation agreements have kept measurable volumes of water in the reservoir. Federal managers have reduced releases from Lake Powell to protect critical elevations. Hoover Dam produces less potential energy from each acre-foot than it would under higher storage. Every one of those statements is supported by operational data. None requires dramatic language. The challenge begins when observations are stretched into conclusions the evidence cannot yet support. One of the most common mistakes is to assume that every decline in Lake Mead is caused by a single factor. Climate influences snowpack, temperature, soil moisture, evaporation, and runoff. Population growth influences demand. Agricultural production influences consumption. Reservoir operations influence storage. Legal agreements influence deliveries. Conservation programs influence withdrawals. Infrastructure influences efficiency. Weather influences everything. The reservoir is the meeting point of these forces, not the product of only one. If Lake Mead falls after a warm winter, that does not prove temperature alone caused the decline. If the reservoir rises after a wet year, that does not prove the long-term imbalance has disappeared. Physical systems rarely offer one cause and one effect. They offer many causes moving together at different speeds. The evidence line protects us from replacing complexity with a comforting story. Another mistake is to assume that conservation alone can permanently solve the problem. Conservation has already demonstrated real value. Water users across the basin have left substantial volumes in the system. Cities have reduced per-person consumption while continuing to grow. Farmers, irrigation districts, tribal governments, and public agencies have entered agreements that produced measurable benefits. Without those actions, Lake Mead would almost certainly be lower today. That is supported by federal estimates, comparing current conditions with scenarios in which those reductions never occurred. But conservation does not create precipitation. It does not increase mountain snow. It does not eliminate evaporation. It does not automatically rewrite legal allocation. It changes demand. The river still determines supply. Believing conservation is useless ignores the evidence. Believing conservation is sufficient without structural reform also ignores the evidence. Both positions simplify a system that refuses to remain simple. The same caution applies to climate. Research increasingly shows that rising temperatures reduce runoff efficiency by drying soils, increasing evaporation, and changing how snow becomes stream flow. Those mechanisms are well documented. Yet no responsible scientist claims that every individual dry year can be explained entirely by warming. Natural variability remains powerful. Atmospheric circulation changes from year to year. Snowfall varies. Storm tracks shift. The correct conclusion is not that climate determines every outcome. It is that long-term warming changes the background conditions in which those outcomes develop. A dry year occurring in a warmer basin often produces different hydrologic consequences than a similar year decades earlier. That distinction matters because it keeps evidence separate from ideology. The reservoir responds to physics, whether people agree on politics or not. There is another misunderstanding hidden inside the phrase buying time. Buying time is sometimes described as failure because it does not permanently solve the imbalance. Yet nearly every successful emergency response in modern infrastructure begins by buying time. Firefighters contain a blaze before rebuilding a neighborhood. Doctors stabilize a patient before surgery. Engineers shore up a bridge before replacing it. Emergency reservoirs hold floodwater before permanent repairs are completed. Time is not the solution. Time is the opportunity to build one. The danger appears only when temporary measures become permanent substitutes for structural decisions. Lake Mead is showing exactly that distinction. The conservation agreements are valuable because they preserve operating space. They become insufficient only if the basin reaches the end of those agreements without a durable framework capable of carrying the system forward. The evidence does not show that the agreements failed. It shows they cannot be the only answer forever. Another assumption deserves careful examination. Some observers believe that because Las Vegas has deep intake tunnels and advanced recycling systems, reservoir elevation is no longer important for the city. Others believe the opposite, that one more dry season could suddenly leave millions without water. Neither conclusion matches the available evidence. Southern Nevada invested billions of dollars to reduce physical vulnerability to lower lake levels. Those investments significantly increased resilience. At the same time, the city remains connected to the Colorado River through legal allocations, energy requirements, infrastructure maintenance, and regional cooperation. Engineering reduced one category of risk. It did not erase dependence on the basin. Infrastructure changes where the weak point lies. It rarely removes every weak point. The same evidence boundary applies to Hoover Dam. Lower reservoir elevations reduce hydraulic head and therefore reduce potential generating capacity. That does not mean Hoover Dam is on the verge of shutting down. Federal engineers have modified turbines, adjusted operations, and expanded the usable operating range over many years. The power plant continues functioning, but every foot of lost elevation gradually reduces flexibility and efficiency. The evidence supports declining operating margin. It does not support claims of immediate failure. Distinguishing between those two realities is essential because public trust depends on accuracy. If warnings repeatedly exaggerate what the data shows, future warnings become easier to dismiss. Reality is already serious enough. Then there is the temptation to treat one encouraging year as permanent recovery. Imagine that the coming winter delivers exceptional snowfall across the Rocky Mountains. Spring runoff improves. Lake Powell receives stronger inflow. Releases increase. Lake Mead rises 20 or 30 feet over the following year. Headlines celebrate recovery. Boat ramps reopen. Shorelines move closer to marinas. Public concern fades. Has the underlying problem disappeared? The evidence would not allow that conclusion. One favorable year demonstrates resilience. It does not erase decades of accumulated deficit. The reverse is equally true. Suppose another extremely dry year follows. Reservoirs decline again. That would not prove inevitable collapse. It would demonstrate continued vulnerability. Evidence lives between certainty and denial. It accepts improvement without declaring victory. It accepts danger without declaring inevitability. This distinction matters because water policy stretches across decades. Decisions made today about conservation, infrastructure, tribal settlements, interstate agreements, agricultural investment, municipal planning, and hydropower will influence conditions long after the current reservoir elevation has changed. Good policy cannot depend entirely on next winter's snow. It must function under a range of possible futures. That is exactly why the Bureau of Reclamation evaluates multiple hydrologic scenarios rather than publishing a single guaranteed outcome. The future is uncertain. Planning must acknowledge uncertainty rather than pretending it does not exist. So where does the evidence point most clearly? It points toward a basin that has become significantly more resilient than it was 20 years ago. Cities use water more efficiently. Infrastructure reaches deeper into reservoirs. Conservation programs can preserve meaningful storage. Forecasting has improved. Cooperation among states, tribes, Mexico, and federal agencies has expanded despite continuing disagreements. At the same time, the evidence also points toward a river system still operating with a narrow margin. Storage remains well below historical highs. Temporary agreements continue supporting reservoir elevation. Future operating rules remain under negotiation. Weak runoff can still erase gains surprisingly quickly. Those two truths exist together. Resilience has increased. Margin has not fully recovered. That is the picture the evidence supports. Return to the image from the beginning of this story. Before sunrise, a federal operations dashboard displays a number close to 1,042 feet. To most people, it looks like one measurement among thousands collected every day. But hidden inside that single elevation is a chain of mountain snow. Dry soil, evaporation, legal agreements, conservation contracts, pumping stations, turbine efficiency, tribal negotiations, farm decisions, city landscaping, electricity markets, and decades of engineering. The lake is not simply recording the amount of water remaining. It is recording how an entire civilization is adapting to a river that no longer behaves as confidently as the calendar once assumed. The event will pass. Lake Mead will rise during some years and fall during others. Conservation agreements will expire, and new ones may replace them. Operating rules will change. Infrastructure will continue adapting. Another winter will bring another forecast. Another spring will test the snowpack. Another summer will challenge demand. But the deeper revelation will remain. A system built around generous margins is learning to operate with much smaller ones. The future of Lake Mead will not be decided only by whether the next storm is wet or dry. It will be decided by whether the basin can transform temporary cooperation into lasting rules before the next period of extreme stress arrives. The reservoir is buying time. The question now is whether time will become reform or simply another resource that slowly runs out.